Welcome back to Asian History. Today, we're going to be talking about the rise of communism. Communism, a concept you might be a bit familiar with at least, and we're going to be looking at where it came from, why it got so involved in Russian politics, how that involves itself with the leaders of Russia, how it informed why Russia changed the way that it did, and ultimately the consequences of that for its people. So the lesson we'll be working out of today is the rise of communism in Russia, which is 12/3/2020. And the first thing we want to look at, and if you're kind of familiar with this image or this person, it's even better. But really the question in step one I want us to think about is, how do ideas translate to power? Right? So you can have a wonderful idea, but what actually makes that idea happen? Right? You have to get a lot of people on board with it. How do you get a lot of people on board? Well, you need people to spread the message. How do you spread the message? We have people go around and speak about it, or they write about it. They give out pamphlets, right? What are good audiences to hear this? You have to have a message that sounds good to a lot of people, not just a few people, right? So you really need a very particular political context and the right people to make this happen. In Russia, we talk about the peasants or the serfs that have been around for hundreds of years, who really are tied to the land and the landowners. This population is ripe for wanting change. They go through several grain shortages. They don't have access to food and bread and all of the resources they really need. They don't make any money, or barely any money, if they're living off of the landowner's land. And it's really the best population for preying upon them to enact a particular ideology or ideal. So think about how ideas translate to power. How these new leaders can come in, they can really focus an entire crowd on some ideas, what tactics they would use to say to really make it happen, and why it ultimately happens too. In this particular instance, we're seeing a picture of Vladimir Lenin. And this guy was really the go-getter for communism in Russia. He's making a lot of these early events happen. He's really influenced by the ideas of Karl Marx, really economic theory itself. And he is looking at this population, and he is saying, I know what you need, even if you do not know what that is, right? He speaks with authority. He speaks with a type of experience that other leaders might not have at this time. And Vladimir Lenin is really pivotal for our understanding of why communism becomes so popular within Russia. Again, how does what the words he say resonate with the crowds? How do these really abstract ideas become policies? How do they become a new government, right? And so for step two, we're going to watch this video, and I want you to identify and submit 3 reasons why communism became popular in Russia. This video goes past 1917 a little bit, which is fine, but we really want to think about what parts of the of Russian history make communism a popular type of ideology. So we'll watch the video in step 2 and find some reasons why it might become popular within Russia.
He was one of the most influential figures of the 20th century, forever changing the course of one of the world's largest countries. But was he a hero who toppled an oppressive tyranny, or a villain who replaced it with another? It's time to put Lenin on the stand in History versus Lenin.
Order. Now, wasn't it your fault that the band broke up?
Your Honor, this is Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, aka Lenin, the rabble-rouser who helped overthrow the Russian Tsar Nicholas II in 1917 and founded the Soviet Union, one of the worst dictatorships of the 20th century.
Oh.
The Tsar was a bloody tyrant under whom the masses toiled in slavery. This is rubbish. Serfdom had already been abolished in 1861 and replaced by something worse. The factory bosses treated the people far worse than their former feudal landlords.
So whenever communism really begins to take shape in the form of rioting, they're seeing that these peasants are being increasingly taken advantage of, being forced into factory labor where they have no real bargaining power with the people who control the factories.
Unlike the landlords, they were always there. Russian workers toiled for 11 hours a day and were the lowest paid in all of Europe. But Tsar Nicholas made laws to protect the workers. He reluctantly did the bare minimum to avert revolution, and even there he failed. Remember what happened in 1905 after his troops fired on peaceful petitioners? Yes, and the Tsar ended the rebellion by introducing a constitution and an elected parliament, the Duma, while retaining absolute power and dissolving them whenever he wanted. Perhaps there would have been more reforms in...
So there's this increased tension that's being created between the political power, the Tsar, and the people who are around him, with the people of Russia. These crowds are emerging. They're not happy with the conditions of Russia at the time, of working in the living conditions. And in some circumstances in 1905, they've been fired upon by the Tsar's guards and military men, right, to stop protests from happening. And even though there's laws or there's changes that's enacted by the Tsar, it's not really seen as enough by the people of Russia.
In due time, if radicals like Lenin weren't always stirring up trouble. Your Honor, Lenin had seen his older brother, Alexander, executed by the previous Tsar for revolutionary activity. And even after the reforms, Nicholas continued the same mass repression and executions, as well as the unpopular involvement in World War I that cost Russia so many lives and resources.
This Tsar doesn't sound like such a capital fellow.
Your Honor, maybe Nicholas II did doom him.
So there are a few different things happening right there. They're mentioning the things with the Tsar, but they're also mentioning Russia's huge failure in World War I, which is in the mid-1910s.
Himself with bad decisions, but Lenin deserves no credit for this. When the February 1917 uprisings finally forced the Tsar to abdicate, Lenin was still exiled in Switzerland.
So who came to power?
The Duma formed a provisional government led by Alexander Kerensky, an incompetent bourgeois failure. He even launched another failed offensive in the war, where Russia had already lost so much, instead of ending it like the people wanted. It was a constitutional social democratic government, the most progressive of its time. And it could have succeeded eventually if Lenin hadn't returned in April, sent by the Germans to undermine the Russian war effort and instigate riots.
Such slander.
The July days were a spontaneous and justified reaction against the government's failures. And Kerensky showed his true colors when he blamed Lenin and arrested and outlawed his Bolshevik party, forcing him to flee into exile again. Some democracy. It's a good thing the government collapsed under their own incompetence and greed when they tried to stage a military coup, then had to ask the Bolsheviks for help when it backfired. After that, all Lenin had to do was return in October and take charge. The government was peacefully overthrown overnight. But what the Bolsheviks did after gaining power wasn't very peaceful. How many people did they execute without trial? And was it really necessary to murder the Tsar's entire family, even the children? Russia was being attacked by foreign imperialists trying to restore the Tsar. Any royal heir that was rescued would be recognized as ruler by foreign governments. It would have been the end of everything the people had fought so hard to achieve. Besides, Lenin may not have given the order. But it was not only imperialists that the Bolsheviks killed. What about the purges and executions of other socialist and anarchist parties, their old allies? What about the Tambov Rebellion, where peasants resisting grain confiscation were killed with poison gas? Or sending the army to crush the workers in Kronstadt, who were demanding democratic self-management? Was this still fighting for the people? Yes. The measures were difficult, but it was a difficult time. The new government needed to secure itself while being attacked from all sides, so that the socialist order could be established. And what good came of this socialist order? Even after the Civil War was won, there were famines, repression, and millions executed or sent to die in camps, while Lenin's successor, Stalin, established...
So this is a bit after that we're really talking about where it transitioned into transitions into Stalin. Still appropriate kind of to understand why communism is becoming big or the effects of that. But this is a little bit after what we're talking about.
Established a cult of personality and absolute power. That wasn't the plan. Lenin never cared for personal gains. Even his enemies admitted that he fully believed in his cause, living modestly and working tirelessly from his student days until his too early death. He saw how power-hungry Stalin was and tried to warn the party, but it was too late. And the decades of totalitarianism that followed after? You can call it that. But it was Lenin's efforts that changed Russia in a few decades from a backward and undeveloped monarchy full of illiterate peasants to a modern, industrial superpower with one of the world's best educated populations, unprecedented opportunities for women, and some of the most important scientific advancements of the century. Life may not have been luxurious, but nearly everyone had a roof over their head and food on their plate, which few countries have achieved. But these advances could still have happened even without Lenin and the repressive regime he established.
Yes, and I could have been a famous rock and roll singer, but how would I have sounded?
We can never be sure how things could have unfolded if different people were in power or different decisions were made. But to avoid the mistakes of the past, we must always be willing to put historical figures on trial.
That kind of gives a good insight into Lenin really made communism a tangible, practical thing within Russia and some of the effects, some of the causes of that. And we want to look further into that. So in step 3, you're going to want to find the rise of communism in OneNote, which looks like this. And you're going to read the following primary sources and answer the highlighted questions. And below are excerpts which detail the rise of communism and economic and political theory which emerged in Russia in 1848. These primary sources track communism's rise in popularity and help to explain how it ultimately became the dominant ideology by 1917 in Russia. There's a variety of sources. I put 3 different sources in here. I've tried to cut out as much as I can just to make sure that you're getting the full impact of these sources, but they really track the change over time of communism, how it becomes really a work of literature to how it becomes the dominant form of government and the economy in Russia by the earliest 20th century, 1917, and kind of thereafter as well, especially in the 1920s. So read through this text, and I've highlighted questions throughout to help get you thinking about some of this source material. And I don't really want to give a strict definition of what communism means because the definitions vary so much, and I want you to really come up with your own definition of what you think it means based on the text that I've included in here. So that should really give you a good idea of what we're talking about by the end of this assignment. And then what you're ultimately submitting is your response to step 2, in addition to your OneNote submission. Please let me know if there's anything I can do to help you out with any of this. Otherwise, have a wonderful day.